Välkommen till läsning av den lila En kurs i mirakler. Och vi läser, jag tror att det är Cameo 11, jag ska gå tillbaka och titta här. Jajamän, som heter The Notes on Sex. Och vi började läsa förra gången. Och det här var anteckningar som Helen tog ner i början av sin karriär som scribe. Och hennes kanal var inte helt ren. Och just när det gäller de här anteckningarna om sex så blandade hon in väldigt mycket av sitt eget. Bland annat så hon tyckte ju om Bill, och Bill var gay och hon var ganska irriterad på det, att han inte gillade tjejer. Så det är väldigt färgat av Helens syn på då att sex egentligen bara ska användas för att göra barn och ingenting annat. Bara i heterosexuella förhållanden helt enkelt. Och att det var väldigt mycket skam kring det här läste vi också om förra gången. Och där vi börjar så handlar det om Helens obekvämhet och hur hon plockade bort mer och mer av det hon hade tagit ner om sex. Hon kände ju naturligtvis att det inte var helt klart och rent. So, Helen's discomfort with this material, however, apparently did not go away. With each editing pass, she took more of it out until there was essentially nothing left. Some of the teachings on sexuality in her notes did not even make it into the text, including that foundational discourse after Miracle Principle 18. But, by the time we get to the Hugh Lynn Casey version, often called HLC, the version prior to the first edition, what was originally 3,300 words on sex has been cut down to about 300. And even in this, the word sexual has been replaced with a more general physical. As a result, the original approximately 60 references to cognates of the word sex, sexual, psychosexual, have been reduced to a single aside. The confusion of sex with aggression serves as an example. Finally, even the brief amount that remains in the HLC is mostly removed from the FIP edition, which does not contain a single reference to the word sex. Many students assume that this material was taken out because Helen saw it as inconsistent with the later teachings of the course. Yet in Appendix 2, we see that Helen's editing focused on stylistic concern, not the theoretical consistency. She herself said, "I assumed the attitude of an editor whose role is to consider only form and disregard content is as much as possible." As we see in the Appendix 2, her editing showed an across-the-board bias against specifics, so that references to concrete phenomena in the world were either removed or reworded so as to be more general. And that is exactly what we find here. References to the concrete phenomenon of sex were either removed or made more general by changing sexual to physical. Further, Helen seemed to be particularly uncomfortable with the sex discussions, as she stated in her notes, giving her even more motivation to remove it. Helen's general editing tendencies, along with her specific discomfort with this topic, then give us all the explanation we need to understand why this material was removed. Is this material inconsistent with the later course? Rather than making hasty assumptions, this is a question that needs to be carefully examined. In this examination, what is especially striking are the many parallels between the early teaching on sex and the later course teaching on special relationship and the body. The early teaching that sexual pleasure is not truly pleasurable itself is mirrored by the course later teaching that physical pleasure is ultimately painful, for it identifies us with the body. The early teachings that in sex we view another as a sex object is mirrored in the later criticism that in romantic relationships we view others as mindless bodies. For relationships to the ego mean only that bodies are together, and it does not object where the mind goes or what it thinks, for this seems unimportant. The early teaching that sex is not for achieving closeness, you have misunderstood sex because you regard it as a way of establishing human contact for yourself, is mirrored in the later teaching that sexual union does not establish real closeness. The union of bodies thus become the way in which you would keep minds apart. The early teaching that sexual attraction itself must be undone, the underlying mechanism must be uprooted, is mirrored in the later idea that what must get beyond attraction to bodies when the body ceases to attract you. Finally, the practical instructions for dealing with sexual attraction and fantasy are strikingly similar in both the early dictation and the later course. In chapter 1 of the text, we are told that in a situation where you experience inappropriate sex impulses, you should invite me, Jesus, to enter. And then he will replace it, the sexual attraction, with love. In chapter 16 and 17, we are told that whenever your thoughts wander to a special relationship which still attracts you, you should allow Jesus to enter and step between you and your fantasies, and then the Holy Spirit will release you from your sexual attraction. The pattern could hardly be more similar. Like Helen, we may find this material uncomfortable, but the evidence that the author of the course genuinely intended it is seizable. For one, there is the sheer length of it, 3,300 words, woven throughout the foundational material on miracles, are not to be dismissed lightly. There is also the emphasis on it. At one point, Jesus says, I want to finish the instructions about sex because this is an area which the miracle worker must understand. Then there is the fact that Jesus never corrected any of it. At this early point in the dictation, he would sometimes tell Helen to correct something she had misheard. She even references this in her comment above. I don't want scribal errors to enter too much into the course, though I guess they will be corrected when they do. Yet none of the material on sex was ever corrected. On the contrary, as we saw when Helen wondered if Jesus would correct these notes, he stepped in to instead correct her doubts. This was important, not only to put those doubts to rest, but because he wasn't finished. Over 40% of the material on sex was still to be dictated. Finally, as we saw above, there are strong echoes of these notes later on in the course. The later course's teachings on physical pleasure, treating others as physical objects, the union of bodies, physical attraction, and the prescriptions for dealing with sexual attraction and fantasy are all markedly similar to the early teachings on sex. There comes a point in which, regardless of any discomfort on our end, we just need to step aside and let the author do what he wants with his book. It is, after all, his book. That point has clearly been reached in the case of the notes on sex. When we first started editing this version, we had a different plan. We corralled all the material on sex in one place, but cut it down to less than 2,000 words and moved it from chapter 1 to chapter 2. That way, rather than being hit with it repeatedly throughout the very first chapter, the reader would encounter just one little fenced-off area in chapter 2. However, we eventually recognized what we were doing. We were attempting to override the author's wishes for his own book. We have therefore included the discourses on sex and have left them in their original order and placement. Så, det var hela cameo nummer 11. Jag har ju läst den lila, jag har läst den svarta också. Jag har läst alla möjliga varianter av kursen. Och jag upplever nog att det ena ger inte mer än det andra. Att det är väldigt mycket som de uttrycker i den här cameon. Att det handlar om är att förstå att jag kan inte se skillnad på njutning och smärta. Och att allt i den fysiska världen är smärta eftersom det är både och. Och att den enda njutning som finns, och det står klart och tydligt på många ställen i kursen, den enda njutning som finns är att utföra Guds vilja, vilket är förlåtelsen här i illusionen. Och att låta sig bli gjord igenom av helige ande. Sen lägger ju vi lägger en sån enorm vikt vid sex. Så jag tänker att det handlar mer om det. Jag tänker att Robert Perry som har skrivit den här boken också gör det. Han lägger stor vikt vid sex helt enkelt och tycker att det är viktigt att njutning och smärta uttrycks med den terminologin. Min upplevelse är inte att någonting har gått förlorat i någon av de här versionerna som jag har läst. Jag är också helt övertygad om att Jesus visste mycket väl vad han gjorde när han bad Helen och Kenneth Wapnick att vad heter det? Editera, säger man så på svenska? editera, göra boken färdig i olika versioner, färdig för publicering. Det är mina tankar kring det här ämnet. Någon fler som vill säga någonting? Då går vi vidare till Cameo 12. Defense are now being used much better. After 2 sections on defense, in chapter 2, the reinterpretation of defenses, and also chapter 2, the atonement as a defense. Helen wrote down personal thoughts and guidance related to her own use of defenses, specifically her defense of truth rather than error. She begins with her talking about feelings of depression and abandonment. She is able to partly get past this by hearing Jesus say, "I will never leave you or forsake you." Last night, I felt briefly but intensely depressed, temporarily under the impression that I was abandoned. I tried, but couldn't get through at all. After a while, I decided to give up for the time being, and he said, "Urtext, don't worry. I will never leave you or forsake you." I did feel a little bit better, Urtext, and decided I was not really sick, so I could return to my exercises. And then, while I was exercising, I had some part vision experiences, which I found only mildly frightening at times and quite reassuring at others. This exchange is actually very similar to one she reported in the very first pages of her notebooks, 2 days before the course began coming through. I was really quite depressed this morning, which is not very unusual. I used to be all the time, but he says, "Be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." In both cases, then she is feeling down and Jesus responds with a Bible quote that offers his own presence as the antidote to her depression. Now Helen reports the part vision experiences that she mentioned above. I am not too sure of the sequence, but it began with a very clear assurance of love and an equally clear emphasis on my own great value, beauty, and purity. Things got a little confusing after that. First, the idea of bride of Christ occurred to me with vaguely inappropriate, probably sexual undertones. Then there was a repetition of the wave of love and a restatement of an earlier experience. Now, as if it were from him to me, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord. Be it done unto you according to his word." This threw me into panic before her text, but at that time it was stated in the more accurate biblical phrasing, "Be it done unto me according to his word." This time I was a bit uneasy, but remembered I had misperceived it last time and probably was still not seeing it right. Actually, it is really just a statement of allegiance to the divine service, which can hardly be dangerous. The earlier experience was one we see in Cameo 8. In the experience, she inwardly heard the same line from the Gospel of Luke that she reports above. Behold, the handmaid of the Lord. Be it done to me accordingly to thy will. In the earlier instance, however, she apparently interpreted this as signaling that she would be physically giving birth to the infant Christ, an idea which made her panic, which Jesus bluntly called egocentric. This time, when she hears it, though, she responds better. Rather than panicking, she is merely a bit uneasy. She remembers that she had seen it wrong last time and realizes the same thing is probably happening now. This then apparently allows her to receive what it really means. Actually, it is really just a statement of allegiance to the divine service, which can hardly be dangerous. She had obviously learned from her previous mistake, and the result was that the intended message was able, at least to some extent, to get through. We can gather the essence of this message by looking at the 2 times she heard the handmaid of the Lord quote. The first time Jesus began by phrasing her as holy, lovely, a perfect shaft of pure light, then told her, blessed are you with Mary, as the mother of the children. And then she heard, behold, the handmaid of the Lord. The second time, he began assuring her of her great value, beauty, and purity. And then there was a repetition of the wave of love, which may refer to the waves and waves of love she felt coming to her from God in her subway experience in 1938. And then she again heard, behold, the handmaid of the Lord. The 2 experiences are remarkably similar. In both, he is clearly trying to get across to her a message of how beautiful and pure she really is, how deeply loved she is, and how holy her role is as the mother of this new birthing of Jesus' teaching. The first time, the magnitude of what was being said about her was too much to handle, and she diverted the message into something her ego would own. Jesus, however, doesn't give up. This message is too important to go unreceived. And when he does repeat it, she is able to avoid her earlier mistake and to let at least some of the message through without distortion. Her impulse to distort the love and affirmation that Jesus is giving her, however, is still present, as the following sequence shows. Then there was a strong sequence in which Christ seemed to be making very obvious advances, which became quite sexual in my perception of them. I almost thought briefly that he turned into a devil. I got just a little scared, and the possession idea came in for a while, the idea of being possessed by an evil spirit. But I thought, this is so silly that there is no point in taking it seriously. As I am writing this, I am remembering that thing in the book about the demon lover which once threw me not spelling into a fit. So I am upset, but the spelling slip is reassuring. So Helen has an inner vision in which Christ appears to be a demon, threatening to possess her. But then she realizes this is so silly. She needn't take it seriously. She is a little upset, but then is reassured by a Freudian slip she spelled through as through, perhaps indicating that what before had really thrown her was now just passing right through her. This morning, we received the whole episode. He said he was very pleased at the comparative lack of fear and also the jag vet inte vad det betyder, commitment awareness? Samtidiga, okay. Awareness, medvetenhet, that it was a misperception. This showed much greater strength and much increased right-mindedness. This is because defenses are now being used much better on behalf of truth more than error, though not completely so. The weaker use of misprojection is shown by my recognition that it can't really be that way, which became possible as soon as denial was applied against error, not truth. This permitted a much greater awareness of alternative interpretations. It was also explained, the shift to the passive form instead of he also explained could be noted. This is an expression of fear. Remember the section in Brotherhood you read last evening about hold fast, and please do so. You can see how much Jesus is trying to reinforce her more healthy response to the demon lover vision. He reviews it with her next morning and he reviews it with her the next morning and tells her he is very pleased at how she dealt with it. Yes, the picture of him as a possessive demon was her projection, but it was a weak projection, which she could regard with little fear, which she could look in the face and deny as real. This is the very kind of healthy denial that he has been teaching her about. Using it frees her mind from having to take this vision at face value. She realizes there could be alternative interpretations and then embraces one. This is so silly that there is no point in taking it seriously. We can see this new use of defenses throughout the above account. She feels depressed, but then is restored when she lets Jesus reassure her of his presence. She hears a line that before caused her to panic, behold, the handmaid of the Lord. But now she realizes she must be seeing it incorrectly and can then receive its real meaning. She sees Jesus making sexual advances, but realizes that's too ridiculous to be real. In all three cases, rather than accepting appearances or her feelings as the truth, she is using her mind to question them and to allow a new interpretation to enter. She is using defense mechanisms to defend the truth and thus to defend her right mind. As a result, the fears that in the past would have thrown her are now passing right through her. She is learning that rather than being dragged under by her negative feelings, she can hold fast in the face of them. She can defend her right mind rather than defending her insanity. Helen is learning, in other words, exactly what Jesus is trying to teach her and Bill at this point. Her experience then provides reassuring evidence that it can be done. As a postscript, it is interesting to note that Helen mentions she was reading from Letters of the Scattered Brotherhood. This book, which does indeed contain a running theme of holding to the spirit in the face of temptation, is considered a 20th century spiritual classic. Its preface says that it was written by a variety of contributors as an expression of their genuine spiritual experience. The preface states that they wrote it in the endeavor to find words to describe and convey the meaning of meditation and spiritual awareness. Anonymity has been preserved for the reason that which contemporary material of this kind, it has been though wise to keep the spiritual significance free from personal associations. It is worth noticing, it is worth noting that Helen was in the process of writing a book that, like the letters, flowed from spiritual experience, was destined to become a modern spiritual classic, and downplayed its scribes' identities so as to keep the spiritual significance free from personal association. Helen was originally entirely anonymous in her role as scribe. As she said in a draft of the preface to the first edition, the course does not need my identity because it can and should stand on its own. All right. Vad lär vi oss av den här cameon då? Jag känner igen mig väldigt väl i hur jag misstolkar och hur helige ande eller Jesus bara fortsätter att undervisa mig. Jag får bara höra samma sak igen och igen och igen, precis som Helen får höra samma sak igen och igen. Och jag kan också känna igen med den här rädslan av att när jag öppnar upp och låter helige ande göra igenom att det skulle vara fel. Och rädslan för att låta egot göra igenom. Men det har jag fått lära mig att jag gör antingen egot till min lärare eller helige ande till min lärare. Det finns ingenting där mitt emellan. Så jag låter egot gå igenom när jag inte låter helige ande gå igenom. Jag tänkte på det när vi läste om att hon tror att Jesus ska possess her och att han är en evil demon. Och jag kan känna igen den rädslan. Jag vet att vi har haft uppe det flera gånger. Nu är det väl kanske något år sedan eller så. Men att det återkommer med jämna mellanrum den rädslan. Och hur vet man att det är Jesus, att det är helige ande? Och det vet man ju bara genom att testa. Och så upplever man ju precis som hon upplever. Hon blir ju lugn. Hon blir inte rädd längre. Det tar bort rädslan när hon lyssnar på Jesus och hör honom klarare och klarare. Så det känner jag igen. Och också att jag allt mer försvarar sanningen och inte misstaget. Att jag ser misstaget. Jag ser egot försöker tänka mig för att jag har kapitulerat till egot såklart, men att jag kan säga nej i allt högre grad och försvara sanningen, tro på sanningen. Någon fler? Då tänker jag att vi faktiskt avslutar. För jag tänker så här, att vi tar juluppehåll. Så det blir ingenting den 19. Och ingenting den 26. Den 26 träffas vi hos Kristina i Trelleborg, för de som är intresserade av det. Och inte heller den 2 januari, men att vi kör igång den 9 januari. Jag tänker att det har gått så länge så att vi vill nog läsa en hel cameo. Börja på en ny cameo. Så den 9 januari startar vi igång igen. Då säger jag tusen tack för den här terminen och god jul och gott nytt år.